So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So, this is in regards to, I guess, the frequently asked question: can women during their cycle touch the Quran? Can they read the Quran? And certainly, can they enter the masjid? In regards to the questions about a period, oftentimes we would just basically rush and answer the question in saying, yes, no, it's haram because a woman during her cycle is impure. That's how people would usually answer the question. But of course, this whole idea of women being impure during their cycle actually comes from a number of different, let's call it resources, different stereotypes, and, just different areas. But of course, in fiqh, we don't answer such questions in such a, let's say, just a fast random answer like that, but we would have to go back to the evidences themselves. And what I wanted to quote, just making sure that everybody understands that a lot of times uh, people would accuse, and unfortunately, I'd even seen scholars, they would come forward and actually say, when I had said that it was permissible for women to touch the Quran, they said that that was influenced by the West and all of that. And I would like to say that this scholar right here, Hussein Afani, my professor in Kulliyat al-Sharia, and also who was my main fiqh teacher. He basically wrote this great article, and this article is not my basis, okay? This isn't my basis because this article is doing the research, and I'm just letting you see, I guess, those evidences and go back to those resources if you would like, and therefore just making it easy for you to visualize and really see right in front of you. It's not something that I am claiming. So here's the thing, in where it is permissible to read the Quran if, of course, we're talking about memory. Can she touch the Quran? Hold on, we'll to that question. We'll talk about it in just a bit. And of course, there are differences of opinions, there's no doubt. But he is saying here that when we're speaking about preponderant, it's important to mention that reading it from, of course, memory, we'll talk about the holding the Quran. It's basically from Madhab Malik, and certainly one of the narrations in Madhab Ahmad. So when we speak about one of the narrations in Madhab Ahmad, it's important to remember that the Hanbali madhab was not a madhab at one point. It was more of a hadith school than actually a fiqh school. And you could see it was also the chosen opinion of Ibn Taymiyyah as well, who was also considered as part of the Hanbali school. And it was considered preponderant also by the scholar, Yemeni scholar, great Yemeni scholar, wrote Nail al-Awtar, and of course other books as well, in where he had regarded that as preponderant, and similarly, of course, with the modern scholar al-Albani as well, in where the reason why he had embraced this opinion is because there was no, look at this word right there, sahihun sarih. This is two things. When we're speaking about something that is basically a resource or an evidence to prove something right or wrong, we would basically have to have one, something that is authentic, and two, just having it as authentic, it doesn't necessarily mean that that proves something, because I need to see that the actual wording is also proving the point that we're focusing on or we're talking about. So when we're speaking about sahihun sarih, in where something that is authentic and something that is basically proving or straight to the point. In other words, it's not containing any ambiguity into the interpretation, and where it's an absolute and direct statement in the field that we're talking about, in where he said, well, there's no authentic and a direct evidence to prove that it is impermissible for a woman to read from her memory. We're going to talk about that. Let's see, in where the hadith that basically was mentioned and narrated, of course, right there, and where لا يقرأ الجنوب ولا الحائض شيئا من القرآن, that a person that in a state of a janaba, which is post-sexual relations, okay, or in a situation for a woman that is menstruating, that they cannot read anything from the Quran. Although you could see that it says it was narrated by Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, and others, but you want to keep in mind that not just because it says narrated by this scholar and that scholar, that is basically saying that they had basically written the hadith, they had the records of that hadith with a chain of narration, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's an evidence to prove that this hadith is sahih. We would have to do further investigation to look into the chain of narrations within these books. So think of these as resources that recorded the hadith, but not necessarily scrutinized the hadith to see whether it is authentic or not. So that's why when we look further in that scrutiny, you could see that some scholars doing the scrutiny, they basically said, like al-Bayhaqi, another Shafi'i scholar, he basically said, well, this hadith really deserves some, let's say, scrutiny in where it's not necessarily something that we would right away and rush to say that it is authentic. The reason for that is because in where he said that al-Bukhari had mentioned that Ismail ibn Ayyash, so there's a person that was within the chain of narrations, within these different narrations. In other words, this actual quote, there is a narrator, and this is the narrator in where he was basically a narrator that we did not know. If he's an anonymous narrator, all right, or if he's a narrator that we don't really know any resource of where he's bringing in such a hadith, and when he quotes off the people of al-Hijaz or even al-Iraq, we just basically know that he has no relationship. In other words, there's this link that he is not whatsoever going to be somebody that we would regard that narration as authentic, because we have no evidence to really prove, let's say, how this hadith traces back. So let's say, and then that's why he said ليس بصحيح, and even though it was narrated off Jabir ibn Abdullah and so forth, so right there we could say that even al-Albani, he basically had commented on that, and he said, and this narration of the people basically of Ahl al-Hijaz is basically right there weak. Another scholar of hadith, he basically said right there that this person is also batil al-hadith. Batil al-hadith, in other words, no one else had said any similar narration, any similar hadith to support this statement, and therefore this statement is baseless. And let's see, Ibn Taymiyyah, he also said, well, this was agreed upon between the scholars of knowledge or in the scholars of hadith, that this is basically weak. So looking at that, when you look at Ishawkani, he also commented, and he said, well, that hadith basically has this narrator, and therefore, of course, we know that his narration of these Hijaziyin would actually be weak. I'm just here making it, just, I guess, clear in wherein he said ويدل أيضا على تحريم القراءة على الحائض وقد قال به قوم والحديث هذا قال به قوم والحديث هذا والذي بعده لا يصلحان للاحتجاج بهما. He said this hadith to actually use as an evidence that prevents and prohibits women from reading the Quran, he said they're not strong enough, or at least authentic, to prove and use as evidence in order to prove that women cannot read the Quran. And in order to say that something is forbidden, something is basically prohibited for women to do or men to do, you would basically have to have an evidence for it. And here's the reference for that. Let's see, it wasn't just that, it wasn't just these scholars, but that's the same thing when you're talking about Ibn Uthaymeen, a very important Salafi scholar. He also said in where when we're looking at he said, when we're quoting Ibn Taymiyyah, he said, well, he's basically right there quoting Ibn Taymiyyah. He said, there's no authentic evidence to prohibit women from reading the Quran. In where there's no authentic, here we go again, صريحة صحيحة. If there's no evidence to prove that, and then therefore she can read the Quran for the following evidence. Number one, in where everything is supposed to be halal, unless there was an evidence to prove prohibiting that substance or prohibiting that action. Everything is supposed to be halal unless proven otherwise. And two, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had generally, in different statements, had basically ordered in imperative words, اقرأوا ما تيسر من القرآن. Read what is basically easy for you to read, etc. So you could see that there's a general statement, a general direct statement ordering us to read Quran, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had praised those that would read the Quran. So in order to somehow exclude anybody from such a ritual would basically require that the person would bring an evidence to prove that. So therefore, if there's no evidence, that direct evidence to prove the prohibition of anybody from reading the Quran, then in that situation, even women are ordered to read the Quran. And then he says, well, if someone were to assume a question and raise a question and say, well, can't we say that the way that we would prohibit a person that is in a state of janaba, which is post sexual relations, the same thing, we could do an analogy and tell them, well, you got to do ghusl in order to read the Quran, because a person in a state of janaba doesn't read the Quran. So, basically, he said, we'll respond in where this type of analogy is basically قياس مع الفارق. And this is basically an usuli statement in where this analogy is not a fair analogy because of the distinctions, because of the differences they both carry. Is a person as a person that is in a state of janaba, they had chosen to basically be in that state. In other words, they can choose to lengthen the time. They're done with their relations. They go later on, take a shower. In other words, 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later, half an hour later, it's basically not a prolonged time. In other words, they could remove this impurity by simply go taking a shower. But for a woman that is in a state of menstruation, it's not going to be something that she's going to be choosing. She just gets her period and she has no choice whatsoever and is not capable of removing, of course, this impurity. And he said, at the same time, the second difference is that a woman, in terms of the lengthening of the time, we're talking about janaba, where it could be a very short period of time. But if we're talking about a period, some women's period can extend up to 15 days, according to the Madhab Shafi'i. And some would be 10, 12, 13 in different times. So if we're talking about such a lengthy period, and of course, looking at a person in a state of janaba where it's a shorter time, then in that situation, it's important to consider in where, if we're going to also consider the women that are going to, of course, postpartum, if we're going to also say they can't read the Quran 40 days, 60 days, not reading the Quran, then in that situation, you could see that in terms of timing, then you're really prohibiting women from ritual, from something that would connect them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Well, we definitely said they cannot pray and they can't fast because we have the evidence to prove that. We've got the authentic ahadith to prove that. So then we would say, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَن يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ. It is not befit for a believing man or believing woman if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees a matter that they would put their own opinion before or even superior to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree. If an evidence is there to prove the prohibition of any matter, then we would basically leave it at that. Yet, if we're speaking about including the Quran and reading the Quran, then we would really need strong evidence. There's definitely authentic evidence in terms of praying and in terms of not fasting. There's definitely authentic evidence, no question about that. It's hadith right there. All right. So when we're looking at these evidences and where even the analogy doesn't actually stand strong, and simply when we're looking at this hadith that was used as a reference, and we're seeing that the analogy is basically making analogy of two separate things in where you cannot do qiyas in matters that are different and say, well, this is related to that, therefore it's the same idea. It's a completely different idea. This is ritual. If you want to do qiyas in ritual, you cannot do qiyas in ritual. This is a completely different item, all right, a completely different matter. So if we're speaking about, of course, someone might say, well, she can read things like a certain portion, excerpts in the Quran that she might read from, or perhaps she wanted to read because she wanted to make sure she goes over the memory. She's afraid she will forget the Quran by leaving it, etc. Or she probably was teaching young kids at school, teaching them in their Quran class. Then in that situation, if we're going to say that that is permissible and that we consider that that was an exception, then in that situation, then how is it that we're prohibiting her from reading dhikr at other times as well? So if you're going to say that that dhikr is permissible during that situations, then why are we prohibiting dhikr in other situations where I wanted to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Let's say, what about the part? Let's look at this one. All right. What about the part in where she's holding the Quran, she's touching the Quran? All right. Majority of the scholars, there's no doubt about that. Majority of scholars would consider that it's prohibited for women to touch the Quran while they're menstruating. And the evidence they used was actually this ayah. Let's look at this ayah. This ayah is in Surah Al-Waqi'ah, and you could see what it says, لا يمسه إلا المطهرون. None shall touch it unless they're pure. But then, of course, they basically said, well, this ayah, none shall touch it. Now, I want you to, I guess, underline and just look at the pronoun it right there, in where what is it referring to? Is it referring to Lawh al-Mahfuz, which basically is the tablet that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had written the different decrees that's basically in the heavens? Or is it referring to the Quran itself? Is that it, pronoun it, or the pronoun ha right there, is it referring to Lawh al-Mahfuz, meaning that the malaika, this would be the malaika, because none shall touch it unless they're pure. If we're talking about the pronoun it referring to Lawh al-Mahfuz, then that situation, that would be referring to the angels, because it's in the heavens. But if we're saying that this it is referring to the Quran, then al-mutahharun would basically be referring to human beings. Well, they have to be in a state of tahara. Okay, but here's one thing. In the science of tafsir, if you're going to talk about a pronoun or you're going to talk about any word, it's not an issue of an opinion. It's an issue of that opinion in interpretation must also stand on evidence. So here we go. We've got this hadith in where the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يمس القرآن إلا طاهر. None shall touch the Quran unless they're pure. You could say in where this hadith, narrated by Malik, al-Darqutni, al-Tabarani, etc., and al-Albani commented on this, and he said in general, in where this hadith, all of its different narrations, in other words, this statement in this hadith, all the different chains of narration that relate to this hadith are actually not free of weakness. In other words, when we're looking at this chain of narration, in where how weak is it? Are we talking about some sort of weakness? Are we talking about strong weaknesses? So he said that the chain of narration in those, it's not that we have someone that was accused of lying. In other words, an extreme type of weakness, but you could see that the reason for such let's say, such classification, in where it could be that we would basically have the narrator that reached the Sahabi is not there, or perhaps that memory wasn't necessarily accurate. And he said, well, this, in where they can support one another, but you could say in where Nawawi had basically said, well, what we would see in here, in where the number of different weak hadith, unless we're talking about strong weakness. If it's not strong weakness, then they would actually support one another. So you could see that there's this differences of opinion in regards to the actual hadith and how we could use it as evidence or not. Let's see right there. In where there are other scholars that basically had said that no, it is permissible for a woman to touch the Quran while she's on her period. Okay, so this is opinion number one. Opinion number one basically said it's best if she doesn't touch the Quran. That's the first opinion, in where they said even though we don't have an authentic hadith, but they could still support one another, and somehow, even though they're not necessarily, let's say, at the strongest level of weakness, but we can somehow gather some weak evidences to make it strong. Well, guess what? That's actually a debate between the scholars of usul. Some scholars of usul, they said, there's no way that you can bring weak evidences and say, here, we're getting weak evidences, but all these weak evidences that we're going to lay forward are going to be basically intensified by one another to prove one strong statement. Not all scholars of usul would actually agree that that is at all logical. So just a standard, just to mention that one. So making sure that we understand this one. Okay. The second opinion basically said, well, it is permissible for women to touch the Quran. And basically the scholars like al-Muzani, who was basically, and also Dawood and Ibn Hazm. So those are two scholars right there, or three actually, Dawood al-Zahiri and Ibn Hazm, even though everybody thinks that they're actually students for one another, but no, they're actually almost 2 centuries apart. And al-Muzani as well, he basically said that, in where we've got from Madhab Shafi'i right there, and we've got Dawood and Ibn Hazm. They basically said, and let's say he's basically saying, and they have a strong statement here. In other words, they really have a strong opinion. And let's say, and he said, and here's their evidence. Number one, there's a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ basically said, Al-mu'min la yanjus. A believer does not become impure. Although it's a general statement, but this hadith was narrated by Bukhari and Muslim. So when he said, Inna al-Muslim, or another narration, or al-mu'min la yanjus, this al right there, and we're referring to basically an inclusive al. and inclusive of any believer, you can't regard them as basically in a state of najasa. So, and of course, the other ones that objected to this when they said, well, لا يمسه إلا المطهرون, we've got an evidence right there. They said, well, that ayah is actually not within the whole conversation. The reason why they said that, because they said, well, because this ayah in the pronoun, that's actually referring to the angels. Therefore, to object to this hadith and say, well, we've got an exception, we've got an evidence to prove that a woman, when in a state of a period or postpartum, is not included within this purity. Because we have this hadith, they basically objected and said, well, we're not necessarily agreeing with you on that, because the pronoun is referring to the malaika, and the pronoun is referring to Lawh al-Mahfuz, therefore making the pure ones really describing al-malaika and not describing human beings. All right. As for the hadith, لا يمس القرآن إلا طاهر, and they said, well, when you look at that, not, the only ones that would touch the Quran, they said, well, when you're looking at scrutinizing as the word tahir to mean pure, it basically is an ambiguous term in where it can basically refer to multiple things, in where it can basically refer to a believer, because we said al-mu'min la yanjus, a believer does not become impure, and we can say that it can refer to a believer. In other words, it's spiritual purity, or we could basically talk about the major impurity. And of course, minor impurities, in where, of course, a believer can have probably, I don't know, some form of impurity and impurity fall on their body. Does that mean a person can never become? But this person, we know that even if it's a believer, they basically had urine on them, some impurity go on them. Does that mean they're never going to be ever in a state of impurity? We know that there can happen some impurity basically go on a believer, but to somehow connect and say that all of this is relating to basically a believer, therefore they cannot whatsoever basically read the Quran because she has this impurity on her, basically needs an evidence. And they basically had rejected this one. And let's see, and Shawkani, again, we go back to him, and he said, well, this hadith doesn't actually prove that that women or somebody that is in a state of impurity, or only the people that are in a state of purity are permitted to touch the Quran. But because we could see that the word tahir, pure, could actually be something that is attributed to a believer or a mu'min as well. And of course, we would know that a person that is a mu'min could also get some form of impurity fall on them. And وَمَنْ لَيْسَ عَلَى بَدَنِهِ نَجَاسَةٌ, and even a person that probably had some form of najasa fall on them or didn't fall on them, that in other words, it's more, we're looking at the word tahir here, in where more of a spiritual type of purity and not necessarily physical purity. All right, and we're just here, trying to lay it out in where al-mu'min la yanjus, in where the hadith is generally a comprehensive statement. Even if we wanted to use that as evidence, it's important to prove that it is related, because it's a comprehensive statement. You would really want to prove that it is basically relating to what we're here talking about, which is menstruation, and simply when we would see that there were differences of opinions in where you could see different terms they can relate, in other words, to different matters differently, to somehow say that this is an evidence to prove that a person is not permitted, or a woman is not permitted to touch the Quran while she has a period, is something that we won't necessarily say that we've gotten evidence for a general comprehensive statement and a word that may actually contain multiple interpretations. Okay, so let's continue right there, and where what about a person or a woman basically entering the masjid? Okay, let's look at this one. فإن ثبت هذا, let's look at this one quote. فالمؤمن طاهر دائما فلا يتناوله الحديث سواء كان جنبا أو حائضا أو محدثا أو على بدنه نجاسة. So he said, even if we were to look at that and where we're seeing the statement, believer a believer is basically going to be always pure, in where this hadith would not necessarily be referring to them, whether the person was in a state of janaba or whether the person was in a state of menstruation, basically a female, or whether the person was in a state of a major or minor impurity, or whether they had some form of impurity on them. This hadith, al-mu'min la yanjus, would be a comprehensive statement which would include all of them. You know, one thing he didn't mention is that the reason for the narration, the reason why the Prophet ﷺ said al-mu'min la yanjus, was actually because Abu Hurairah, he was in a state of janaba. He saw the Prophet ﷺ, but he didn't say assalamu alaikum. He was wanting to say salamu alaikum, but he didn't want to say salamu alaikum, and he ran to his home, basically scurried to go take a shower in order to come back and say salamu alaikum. And then Abu Hurairah just goes and scurries home, takes a shower, and comes back, and then he tells the Prophet ﷺ, well, I didn't want to say salamu alaikum because I was in a state of janaba. That's when the Prophet ﷺ had said al-mu'min la yanjus, a believer does not become impure. So here we go. Even though he was in a state of janaba, impurity, then we would say that if he was in a state of janaba and the Prophet ﷺ had basically commented, al-mu'min la yanjus, well, that's the same thing. That would also support the opinion that this hadith, this quote, cannot be something that would include a woman, this would actually include a woman in a state of menstruation, in where she would also be al-mu'min la yanjus, a believer does not become impure. So therefore, she would basically be included in where she's in a state of tahara, period. Let's see, what about women entering the masjid? And he said it is permissible for a woman to enter the masjid if she basically was sure that the place was going to be basically clean. Basically, she was sure that she wasn't going to contaminate the place. And of course, when you say ala rajah, which is preponderant, in where you would say that, of course, there are differences of opinions. And this isn't something that we were somehow influenced by the West, but now you could see that this was an opinion that was mentioned by Imam Ahmad, at least in one of their narrations, and simply al-Muzani as well, and Dawood and Ibn Hazm as well, both different scholars. And simply, this was also the chosen opinion by al-Albani in his book Tamam al-Minna. Okay, And you could see in where he said, and what actually proves that it is permissible is basically if we're talking about that a person is supposed to be al-mu'min la yanjus, in where a person, a believer, does not become impure, and at the same time to actually say and exclude a woman from entering the masjid. Everything is supposed to be halal unless proven otherwise. To exclude a woman from entering the masjid, then you would really have to have strong evidence. And he said, again, we don't have an authentic, direct evidence to prove that a woman during her cycle cannot enter the masjid. As for what was narrated, let's look at this hadith in where the quote, لا أحل المسجد لجنوب ولا حائض. I do not permit this masjid basically to be entered by a person that is in a state of janaba slash a person that is basically post sexual relations or even in a state of menstruation. Well, when you're looking at this hadith, hey, this is really straight and really direct. But this hadith is actually not authentic. And the scholars that had regarded it as not authentic is number one, al-Khattabi basically did an outstanding, I guess, sharh for Sunan Abi Dawud, and al-Bayhaqi, and Abd al-Haq al-Ishbili, and al-Nawawi, and al-Albani. And he said, and Ibn Hazm probably went far, but he actually said, إنه باطل. Batil to mean that this hadith is really objecting or even having no resource, nothing in where to prove it, in where it is actually all baseless. Okay, so let's see. This is what Ibn Hazm had said. And when you look at that, and where the other evidence, they said, well, if a kafir can enter the masjid to perhaps, I don't know, learn about Islam, ask a question, do their shahada, whether it's a woman or a man, they can enter, then in that situation, if a person, if a Muslim, if we're telling a kafir they can enter, then a Muslim is actually precedent in that permission to enter the masjid, even if she had her period. And he said, in summary, it is permissible for a woman in a state of a period to read the Quran from her memory, and it is permissible to even touch the Quran, and perhaps it would be best just, and the word is khurujan min al-khilaf, which basically means in where perhaps, I mean, just to stay out of the differences of opinions, maybe it is best if she would perhaps touch it with perhaps gloves or something, but at the end she is permitted to touch the Quran, but if she wanted to stay on the safe side, that's also a good idea. Okay, and it is permissible for her to enter the masjid on a condition that she basically ensures that she is not going to contaminate the place. This is basically right there, our resource. Maybe we could share it. You know, I just thought that to bring about the best answer would be just to actually go to a really thorough study that was done. My great and outstanding professor. He was a professor that we were not capable of messing with. That's my fiqh professor. That's my usul professor. Very, very smart, and did not care if there was any objection. He will say what the evidences support, and he will not whatsoever intimidate and try to intimidate others to accept him, or somehow be intimidated to say one thing. But no, he will say what he thinks the evidence is proving. And yes, this is it.